Now, I'm just gonna come right out and say it. Resident Evil is not about zombies. And it was never completely about survival horror.
To call Resident Evil franchise a shoot-'em-up action game or B-movie zombie survival horror is not only doing the franchise a disservice, but is also dismissive of the point of what the core franchise actually is in terms of gameplay and the innovations that came with almost every game. Even from the beginning, the survival horror term that is used to repeatedly describe the franchise was never entirely accurate to begin with. And sometimes fans kind of get lost in a sort of love affair with the zombie narrative.
But it's important to note that while the first games are deliberately built around quiet horror suspense and zombie movie nostalgia, the gameplay itself is built on a solid foundation of action, exploration, and puzzle solving.
The only aspect of survival that comes into play is supply conservation and the option of dispatching or avoiding enemies. And even that was just one aspect of the original games. Having a scary game about zombies and survival would simply just not have been enough for a Resident Evil game in 1996. Some hardcore fans who are quick to call Resident Evil a zombie game sometimes forget to mention the enemy variety throughout the original games. There are many games, and I mean many, that might fit that description more accurately, and I don't believe that Resident Evil got popular solely because of the zombie enemies or the zombie archetypal movie nostalgia factor. The time of its release, for instance, could not have been better for what Resident Evil specifically had to offer. No one had seen the kind of graphics, gameplay, or cinematic presentation in an early 3D game quite like what Resident Evil achieved with that high amount of polish. I would even go as far as to say that Resident Evil would have worked without using zombies or a narrative that created zombies. Why would I make that kind of claim?
Dino Crisis, anyone? But where would that leave Resident Evil 2, 3, and the other games that revolved around massive zombie and biohazard infections?
Well, the featured Umbrella Corporation did have many laboratories that created deadly, bioorganic, non-human creatures. All the producers and developers would have had to do is create a narrative with a crisis involving massive, and I mean massive, POW escapes in a city-wide scale with the same gameplay and design. And while that wouldn't have the same cinematic horror nostalgic charm, unique enemies like Lickers, Hunters, Chimeras, Tyrants, and the Nemesis would more than make up for the lack of zombies.
But this, of course, is looking at the gameplay aesthetics and narrative strictly from an objective point of view.
Even after playing almost every Resident Evil game released prior to 2005, at the time I saw the franchise for what it was, a highly polished horror cinematic action-adventure experience. The games did not disappoint, well, for the most part. But when fans wondered why such a dramatic shift in gameplay and tone would come with the release of Resident Evil 4, they also forget that after the release of Resident Evil Code Veronica, the sales of the core franchise began to decline as more competition from other big-budget 3D multi-platform games continued to offer refined and solid gameplay on an even bigger scale, or at least comparable scale. And gamers like me only have so much time and money to spend, and we don't just want to limit ourselves to just one genre.
Of course, you can argue that making the Resident Evil remake and Resident Evil 0 GameCube exclusives did the franchise no favors.
It is a shame because I feel they are two of the best games in the franchise. But with aging gameplay that used the same formula as the originals, this was somewhat of a point of contention at the time for reviewers and some fans of the franchise.
Now, I'm not suggesting that the Resident Evil franchise had to make concessions in order to compete with other franchises.
But eventually gameplay has to evolve if a franchise wants to continue to grow. Well, for the most part.
Well, I won't argue that the dramatic changes and shift in tone of the recent core Resident Evil games pulled away from the classic spooky atmosphere of the original games. It still doesn't make them just action horror shoot-'em-ups.
In order to challenge a player, the newer games require that the player play smart, use shots carefully, and supplies wisely, so they're not a complete departure from the original games. It would be like criticizing the sequel Aliens for eschewing the quiet horror suspense of the original movie in favor of action horror suspense. It's just a different kind of horror. And why shouldn't Resident Evil have the same chance to expand and build on the originals when it comes to the horror genre? Why narrow the focus of the franchise in favor of having to only include a horror archetype like zombies and spooky haunted mansion settings? That would be like calling a Castlevania game bad because it didn't have enough vampires or castles in it. Horror in a game should come from tension, not just repeated scares or constant horror cliches. To me at least, fear and enjoyment from Resident Evil comes from the tension of facing and overcoming horrors inspired by the many sources in horror science fiction from the last century.
Admittedly, while I've never been much of a horror fanatic, it still doesn't take away from what I like about the games, regardless of how much the franchise has changed over the years.
Whether a horror franchise like Resident Evil has zombies or the word survival horror on the screen is irrelevant, and fans may not always agree on what is scary and what isn't scary, or what makes a Resident Evil, well, Resident Evil.
But we can at least agree that even after almost 20 years of sequels and spin-offs, there's at least a little something in a given game for any kind of fan of horror games, past or present. Thanks for watching, take it easy, and keep gaming.